hello. We are so thrilled again for you to come into our space and to get another segment of Mississippi, Meet My Mississippi Authors and Artists. Again, I have another amazing author friend for you today, and I want him to introduce himself and let you know where he's from. Tell the people where.
First, Patricia, let me just say how much I appreciate the invitation and also the work that you do.
Thank you.
And you spread goodwill, and I admire you for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Tell them your name and where you're from.
My name is Al Price. I presently live in Henderson, Tennessee, but I really grew up in Yalobusha County, Mississippi, just below Oxford. And I was born in Oakland, and I spent some of my childhood in Coffeyville, and I graduated from high school at Water Valley.
Oakland is beautiful. Oh my, they got
nice
some
little town.
It is. They have some places that you might want to see. Yes.
Oh, absolutely. And after that, I eventually graduated from Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas. And from there, UT Knoxville and University of North Texas, University of Alabama, actually just about everywhere we live.
You were there. You were in school.
I went to graduate school someplace. But I think the fondest memories that I have is living in rural Mississippi on what was called then the Oakland Coffeyville Road. It was very rural, and we lived with in an extended family for a period of time. And my grandparents and their two youngest daughters were still at home, and there were always some cousins around.
Wonderful.
So I always had
beautiful.
someone to pay some attention to me, and I guess I have to admit I was somewhat mischievous in the sense that when the two young daughters, when their boyfriends would come to visit them, I was always in the way. And I did some really crazy things.
All right. Well, we'll have to know
to
about those
aggravate
things in a
them.
book later on. You need to write about those. Okay, with every one of my authors and artists, I try to go back to where I know these amazing people from. So that's where I'm going to start. How did I meet Al Price? Now, most of the people that I've met that we've been talking about, I did meet them on Facebook. That was our initial contact. So with you, I would go, I'm always talking about Mississippi and promoting positive Mississippi and getting Ole Miss stuff in there and things like that. So I found you through your name, Chester Rebel.
Yes.
Okay, I didn't know your name at
That's
all.
my username.
For the long time that we were talking and emailing or whatever, I didn't know who you were from a can of paint. We were just friends, you know, talking back and forth about Mississippi stuff and Ole Miss stuff. So then we found out that we're members of the Church of Christ and that you're a minister. I know a lot of places and people kind of, you know, that's how we met on Facebook. And then you're an author, and then we found out that we had those kind of things in common. So tell us about your writing, when you started writing.
It's sort of a mutual background that you and I have had in a lot of ways. And so for most of my career in college teaching, I read very formal kinds of things, and when I presented, I wrote from a scientific perspective, and it was very formal writing. And so once I started writing this historical novel, I found that there were times when I would lapse into that formal style, and it took me a while to learn how to write simple things, commonplace kinds of things,
So
and to
before
get
this
out of
book,
that.
what were you write? What did you write when you were younger or high school or anything?
No, I was not really a writer. I never have really thought that I wrote well.
Okay.
And I still,
And a lot of people, a lot of writers feel that way. That's why they don't get their stuff out there.
Yeah.
You know, and I call them closet poets and writers because they just write their stuff and stick it under the bed. They don't want anybody to read it. I'm like, stop the madness. Get your stuff out there.
Yeah, a lot of people have a book in them.
Inside. They really,
really do.
Now, we want to know all about this book. Your book is?
Ethereal.
Okay. And?
Let me give you my own definition
Okay.
because when you look ethereal up in the dictionary, there are a lot of different definitions. So I decided that it would
Put
help.
it in the book to help people.
Right, it would
Yeah.
help the reader understand exactly
What you're talking
what I'm
about.
referring
Yes.
to. And before the prologue, it says, the quality of being able to place oneself on levels of invincibility and seeming to belong to another world, created through poetic imagination with notions of justice and fairness.
Beautiful, isn't it? We should all aspire to that.
Yeah.
You know, we should all kind of aspire
He
to
said that he walked on the ethereal plane, and he explained this to his friend Joe Nathan, this African American
Okay, you're
young
jumping
guy.
ahead of me. Wait. Let's get started first. Now tell me about the characters in the book, and where did you get the characters? Where did these people come from? Where did they come from?
I'm glad you asked that.
Yes.
Actually, the story, Ethereal, took place over a period of 35 years.
Okay.
And in the early 70s, we lived in Knoxville, where I was in graduate school. And that was the same period of time that Archie Manning was the superhero
Everything.
at Ole Miss, and I just kept up with him, and I read everything I could find on him. And it so happened that I have always had a problem going to sleep at night. So what I started doing every night when I went to bed, I would create this story of a boy from Mississippi
Okay.
who had all of these skills, and I started carrying his life forward. So every
Okay.
night I would take it just a little bit farther, and then eventually in '04, I had retired from one of my jobs, and I thought, well, you know, I think that story is worth telling. So I had never written anything before, so I started. And by the way, just jumping into the fray, that's what I recommend. You know, people say, well, no, I can't write, but if you just start,
Absolutely.
if you just start and then let someone else read it and critique it, that's where you can go.
Right.
And that's what
now,
I recommend.
When did you first start just writing those little parts down? When did you very first start?
Oh, I didn't start until between '04 and '06.
Okay. Okay.
And the first edition came out in around '06.
Okay. Okay.
Now
Now tell us about the characters. Introduce us to the main characters in this book.
well, the protagonist, the main character, is Amon Lee Mistral. And he is a young man that when he was born in Louisiana, the midwife told his mother that he had a special mission in life. She could not tell her what it was, but it was his quest to find it. And also, she said, now, I know a way of delivery that will ensure that this person is going to be brilliant,
Okay.
smart. So I picked the story up at age 12. They have now moved to Mississippi and bought a little piece of land. They're still dirt farmers when
Okay.
everybody else had just about given it up.
Okay.
And so his father has an awful accident. He breaks his hip sawing down a tree that fell the wrong way, and they really didn't have the money for adequate treatment, and he fell into deep depression. And at age 12, he heard his parents talking about not knowing what they were going to do or how they would get the bills paid. And the next morning at 5 o'clock, they hear their old tractor crank up, and Amon Lee's on it. And he's going to the field to start plowing.
Okay.
And so he does remarkable things for his parents. And the story is about how he protected people in the community, how he was the best friend of people who were in some way or another abused, He was a defender of right. He was a person who upheld justice. As a matter of fact, if I may, to describe my character,
And talk about the football element in here and the two main characters and how
Sure.
they interact and all of that.
I'm glad to do that. But I found a quotation from William Faulkner,
Everybody knows I love William Faulkner quotes.
and this is from Intruder in the Dust. And
That was a movie, y'all.
yeah, I saw that black and white movie back in the late 40s. And this describes my main character.
Okay.
Some things you must always be unable to bear. Some things you must never stop refusing to bear. Injustice and outrage and dishonor and shame. No matter how young you are, just refuse to bear it.
Love
Well, that's
Faulkner
my
is amazing.
character.
You know I love his quotes. I mean, they are so deep. They're simply deep. You know what I mean? It's great. So now the football element, where does that come in and all that, the goal and all that? Tell us about
Well,
that.
about the middle part of the book, they've now, his friend, Joe Nathan Markham, who's an African-American kid that lived nearby, and they are the best of friends, and they do everything together. And after an adventurous trip to Memphis, they didn't have enough money to go on the senior trip to Florida, so they saved up enough money for a bus trip to Memphis.
Okay. Okay.
They get into all kinds
That's a big
of
city.
trouble in Memphis and on a cruise boat going south to New Orleans. But when they finally get back home, they must decide what they're going to do. And Joe Nathan has decided to join the United States Marine Corps. And Eamon Lee decides that he's going to Ole Miss. He's going to make arrangements for him to go and walk on as a football player.
Okay.
And he had about 2 weeks to prove himself and to
Okay.
get a scholarship. Otherwise, he'd have to come back home. So he was amazing on the football field.
Okay.
He did get a scholarship, and the last half of the book has Ole Miss football in the background of the story.
Okay.
But it's still about the human condition and his relationship with his parents, and also Joe Nathan.
Okay. What is the overall message of this book? What is it you want to tell, and what do you want people to take away from it? What is the specialness of how you wrote it, and how it's going to grab you into learning the message that you want to give?
Well, I like stories and movies that have a healthy and virtuous message. A message of justice, upholding the right. Yet neither of my books are what you would regard as Christian literature, even though religion plays a major role in the book. At the beginning of Ethereal, I have this quotation that describes him. But concerning my own wish for the reader, I appear to be hot-wired to include noble purposes, something that will help to create a more just and a fair world. And so those are the guiding principles that are held up. Sometimes it's not possible unless we're able to recognize these areas of life where that is needed. So in my own experience that I write about in a memoir that I mentioned earlier, that's unpublished, but it is in the hands of a publisher in New York.
Yes,
and so
we're definitely going to talk about that.
We really want that to happen.
Yes.
I had to have in my own life what I call a Damascus Road experience that sort of got my attention, and so where I realized that I need to transform a lot of my own values. And it was a kind of moment of truth for me. So I think, well, you know, I'm sure that there are a lot of other people who've had similar experiences.
Right.
And maybe by sharing my story
Absolutely.
and how things happen to transform my own value system,
Absolutely.
maybe that will help.
And that's what I tell people about being an author and getting your stories out there. It can help so many people just by telling your stories.
And you don't have to be preachy to do that.
Absolutely.
You just
tell
can
your
tell the
life,
story
or
and the
whatever.
facts and let the reader,
Absolutely.
obviously see what's there.
Absolutely.
And what they can apply to their own lives.
Because we all have so much more in common than we don't have in common. We
Yes.
really do in the human experience. So tell us about this other book, the name of it, the memoir. Tell us about it.
Well, once I had written Ethereal, my mind kept going back to my growing up years, and even though we lived way out in the country, rural Mississippi, nevertheless, there were some very significant social events that occurred in the early years of my life. For example, the Great Depression. Now, I did not live through the Great Depression, but I say in the book that my parents made me think that I did,
Right.
because we had to be
Right.
so
Tight
frugal
with everything.
in
Right, because they
everything.
lived through that.
So the Great Depression, World War II, the Southern Labor Movement, the Civil Rights Movement, the advent of the Rock and Roll Revolution, and then the turbulent '60s. And I lived through all of that, and I thought I had a unique perspective about the values that I developed, and how eventually I came to a point where I realized I needed to go in another direction. And so I write about that. It's titled Gravel and Grit.
Okay.
And gravel stands for the coarse, unflattering, rather shameful side of the culture. But grit, on the other hand, refers to the remarkable will to survive and the virtuous behavior that I saw when I was growing up.
Okay.
One other thing, the South is the most written about region
Absolutely.
in the country.
Absolutely.
And if you look at the literature, most of the books fall into one of two categories. One category is that everything is romanticized. It was idyllic. It was just wonderful, as in Gone with the Wind, for example.
Right.
And then the other extreme is the South is demonized.
Absolutely.
Everything is terrible and no good people. And so I decided, well, the truth is always somewhere
In between.
in the
there
middle.
somewhere. Yes.
And so I decided.
And there are two sides of every coin. That's what I try to tell people in my books and in my world and in Mississippi. There's not just one side. There's always one and two. There's two sides of the
So I talk about both.
Yes.
Gravel and
Yes.
grit.
Yes.
And then the subtitle is A White Boyhood
Okay.
in the Segregated South.
Okay.
And not many white people have been willing to objectively look at their experience growing up. Not nearly as much in the literature. And I thought, well, my
That's
perspective,
what your book is for.
yeah, it can contribute
Yes.
to the overall
Yes.
understanding.
Yes. And we
And
need that.
So that's sort of what I attempted to do. The book is it consists of stories covering a half page to maybe 2 or 3 pages.
Okay.
And it was really interesting. The first manuscript that I sent to an editor in New York, I sent him 515 pages.
Oh my goodness.
And this guy is a former editor of the New York Times, and he said, well, Al, I can tell you right now, the first thing that we're going to have to do is trim, and delete.
Right.
And that was really hard for me to, I deleted a lot of good stuff,
Right.
But he said, you got to keep the reader in mind,
Yes.
and you got to move your good stuff to the front.
Right.
And so I've got one of my better stories halfway down the first page of chapter 1.
Okay, wonderful. So what are some of the segments in the book? Like, are they like in little time periods or different stories or what? How did you do it with your memoir? How did you do it?
Well,
How did you divide it up? You just started from one thing to another, or from different scenes and different incidents?
progressively through my life. Chapter 1 is titled "Licking Old Man Depression,"
Okay, okay,
which was a term that was used by President Roosevelt.
okay, okay.
And when he visited various places impoverished, he said, "We're going to lick old man depression."
Okay, okay.
And my father was in one of his programs, the CCC Camp,
Right.
Civilian Conservation Corps.
And he visited Tupelo. Roosevelt came to Tupelo, gave a speech. Yeah.
Yeah, he loved to go to the
Yeah,
camps.
yeah, yeah.
And he didn't really think the dole or just giving people money
Right.
was the best thing to do. And you had these young, strong, healthy young men that wanted to work.
Yes.
However, the depression had taken such a toll that 70% of the young men that enrolled for the CC camps were malnourished,
Really?
and some of them dressed in rags.
Really?
But now they would have a uniform, 3 square meals a day, recreation, and work, and they would get paid $30 a month.
All right.
25 of that would go home to mama, and that would buy a lot of
Oh,
groceries.
yeah, absolutely.
And then they got to keep $5 for a month. But in
Hey,
1935,
that's a lot. And you're taking care of your
$5,
family, too.
$5 would
Go a long
buy a
way.
lot of weekend fun.
Okay. Right?
So I start there, and then World War II, and I talk about our sacrifice. My uncle Thomas, who was in World War II, and my father was turned down because he was blind in his left eye. But this was a time when the country was united. It was amazing. Everybody.
By one purpose.
See,
It's like
Roosevelt
when you get
convinced
behind-
everybody that you can contribute something. And my father volunteered to work at Camp McCain. Have you ever heard of Camp
Yes,
McCain, just below
absolutely.
Grenada?
Absolutely.
This was a German prisoner of war camp. And also it trained soldiers, basic training and ready to go to Europe. At one time there were 7,000 German prisoners of war there.
Oh, really?
That's correct.
Wow.
And where we lived, I was very young, maybe 3, 4, one of my earliest memories, really. Behind our house, in a little ways, was a fence, and every day they would, the German soldiers, they would get out and exercise them, and they would walk by that fence.
Wow.
And every day, I'd go out there and look at them, and if I have time, there's one little story about that.
Yes.
Absolutely. Every day, I noticed that there was this one German soldier who would always look at me and smile and wave. And every day I would pick him out, because I knew he'd pay some
Right.
attention to me. And that went on for a while. And one day, he had evidently made me a toy. And he had the toy with him. And he broke out of line
Oh.
to come over and hand me the toy. Except one of the guards saw him do that, and that was a no-no.
No, right.
And so the guard got him back in line and everything. And later, someone told my mother that the reason he probably did that was because he had a son back in Germany,
Oh, my goodness.
the same age I was. And I reminded him of his son, and he did not know whether he would ever
Right.
see
him
his
again.
son again. And that was
Wow,
really quite an
that's
experience.
amazing.
So stories like that, if you like that story, Gravel and Grit is just full of them.
That is absolutely amazing. Okay, so tell us, when is the timeline for Gravel and Grit? Is it with someone in New York, right? What are
Yeah,
we looking for? What
there's
are we
an
waiting
agent
on?
that is pitching it to traditional publishers, and the truth is that today it is really hard for a nobody writer like myself to break into
Yes,
that traditional
absolutely.
field. And even memoirs, you know, they want memoirs of well-known celebrities and politicians and people of that nature. So we're working hard, and of course, you know, I can go the self-publishing route, but so far I'm holding out for a traditional publisher, and just I expect to hear something any day.
All right. So what's special about Al Price's writing, and what do you expect to get what message, and what do you expect to get when you get one of your books? What do you want to tell the people, just in general?
Well, really much like what you're doing and promoting, I want people not only to be entertained, and I, when they finish either of the books, I want them to have a smile on their face.
Okay.
I want them to see the possibilities in their own life. I want them to be encouraged to value justice and fairness among all people, and to become a better person. And you can do that, as I said earlier, without being preachy.
Right.
You know, without telling them step by step what you've got to do. You just tell a good story,
and
the meaning is pretty obvious, you know.
Well, you want this book, and you want that next book that we know is going to come out of New York like a blockbuster. We're waiting on it, because we have some wonderful Mississippi authors and artists. Thank you again for tuning in to another segment of Meet My Mississippi, Authors and Artists. This is Patricia Neely Dorsey.
It's inside me, girl, it's in the air. It's who I am through and through. It won't take long till it gets to you. It's everywhere. Mississippi magic is sweet molasses breeze. God, country, family, that's what it means to me. Mockingbirds and bumblebees, magnolia blossoms and dogwood trees. Ice cold tea that tastes so sweet. It's the cold